When you hear the name Queen Elizabeth I, what do you picture? A pale, red-haired woman with an enormous collar and even bigger dress? For a lot of people, those are the essential characteristics of good Queen Bess. So much so that that's how she's been immortalized in cheap Halloween costumes. While the huge ruff and farthingale have become synonymous with the general perception of Elizabethan fashion, there is so much more to 16th century clothing than movies and Renaissance fairs would lead you to believe. Elizabeth's reign from 1558 to 1603 saw huge changes in fashion, some quite revolutionary. So today we're going to take a look, decade by decade, at Elizabethan fashion to learn about the unique styles that existed throughout the last half of the 16th century. Before we really begin, I want to go over a little bit of terminology that I'll be using in this video. If you want a deeper dive into each of these garments and what they look like, be sure to check out my Dressing a Tudor Queen and Dressing a Tudor Common Woman videos. The smock is the basic undergarment for women during this period and is made of linen. It has long sleeves and can have a high or low neckline, and usually falls below the knee to about mid-calf. You might have heard it referred to as a shift or chemise, but English people of the 16th century knew it as a smock. Farthingales are underskirts stiffened with rows of dried grasses or reeds called bents, and later whalebone to provide a particular silhouette to the skirt of the gown. The shape of farthingales will change during the century, as we'll see later. While many people credit Catherine of Aragon for introducing farthingales to England from Spain, they don't become widely worn until the 1540s. One of the earliest written references to a farthingale in an English wardrobe is in 1545 for a red satin farthingale for then Princess Elizabeth. Partlets are small garments for covering the chest and neck. There are essentially two types of partlet: white linen partlets that are worn next to the skin, and partlets often of black velvet or satin, or sometimes fabric to match the gown, that are worn on the outside of the gown. The kirtle is the basic underdress of the 16th century. The bodice of the kirtle, often called the bodice or upper bodice, is usually stiffened with layers of fabric like canvas and buckram. It provides support for the female figure as well as create a fashionable silhouette. Unlike a petticoat, which also has an attached bodice in the 16th century, the kirtle of an elite woman is meant to be seen and usually made of quality fabric. Sometimes the front or forepart of the skirt is made of a more expensive fabric, and cheaper fabrics are used for the portions of the kirtle that will be hidden under the gown. Foreparts can be integral to the kirtle or made separately and changed out according to the outfit. Gowns come in a variety of styles in the 16th century, but are usually worn over other garments like a kirtle. Gowns can be made with a closely fitted bodice and gathered or pleated skirt, or they can be loose one-piece garments from neck to hem. Men also wear gowns, usually of the loose one-piece variety, but that is a different video. With those terms in mind, let's get into the fashion. I actually want to start a bit before Elizabeth becomes queen because I think it's important to know where we're coming from. The early 1550s still retained many features that we associate with Henrician Tudor fashion, such as wide turnback sleeves on the gown, full fore sleeves or undersleeves, and French hoods. Portraits of Mary Tudor as queen really typify this style from the 1550s, as she reigned from 1553 to 1558. It was particularly fashionable to wear a partlet of black velvet or satin, or sometimes matching fabric, to cover the wide square neckline of the gown, with a linen lining embroidered with black work. The French hood became quite angular and almost squarish in shape, compared to the more circular shape that was fashionable before and after. Another style of gown that was popular during the 1550s was a high-necked, loose-fitting gown worn over a kirtle. In these portraits, the gowns are both trimmed with fur and most likely lined with fur as well, and the short puff sleeves reveal highly decorative lower sleeves. On both of these examples, there are gold aglets used for embellishment and to fasten the gown. It's in the 1550s that we see the beginning of what will become the ruff that is so synonymous with Elizabethan fashion. These small, modest ruffles at the neck are attached to a linen partlet, and there are matching ruffles at the wrist, which may be stitched to the sleeves of the smock or made separate and attached temporarily. The earliest confirmed images of Elizabeth as queen from 1558 or 1559 show her very similarly dressed in a black loose gown lined with ermine, worn over what might be a more fitted high-necked gown or kirtle. It's actually a bit difficult to tell what's going on with the garment under the loose gown since there's a lack of definition at the waist and neck. It could be something like the loose kirtle in Patterns of Fashion, although that doesn't have a collar. It's interesting to note the sleeve style on both loose gowns, a half-length sleeve with fullness at the shoulder and a long hanging sleeve behind. Moving into the 1560s, we see a lot of the loose or semi-fitted one-piece gown over a kirtle combination, which stays in fashion with some variation throughout the rest of the 16th century. Both Queen Elizabeth and Mary Hill wear highly embellished kirtles with low arched necklines. The gowns are worn open to reveal the kirtle underneath and are caught at the waist with a girdle. Both have short puffed sleeves that have been slashed and decorated with pullings out of white fabric. The partlets are also heavily embroidered and featured ruffs, which have started to grow in size from those seen in the 1550s. The ruffs themselves start to become separate pieces from the partlet as they get larger and require more precise starching and ironing to create the figure-8 sets. Other variations on the kirtle and loose or semi-fitted gown include sleeve length, like the half-length sleeve seen here on a lady of the Wentworth family and the Countess of Lincoln. The gowns are worn closed from neck to waist, utilizing aglets like we saw in the previous decade, and open to reveal the forepart of the kirtle. These gowns are also of the semi-fitted variety, following the silhouette created by the kirtle, but likely cut in one piece from shoulder to hem. Another dominant style of gown during the 1560s featured a closely fitted bodice with a square arched neckline and a full skirt, which was sometimes open in front to reveal the forepart of the kirtle beneath it. Sleeves of the 1560s were often full at the shoulder, but quite fitted and narrow along the arm, as in this portrait of Queen Elizabeth. A popular combination was a short puffed sleeve with lower sleeves from the same fabric and decoration as the gown, or heavily embroidered sleeves to match the heavily embroidered partlet. Portraits like this one clearly show the blackwork neckline of the smock beneath the partlet. There are also numerous references to matching sets of partlets and sleeves in Elizabeth's wardrobe. As we move into the 1570s, everything starts to get a little bit wider: shoulders, sleeves, skirts, and ruffs. Both of these early 1570s portraits of Queen Elizabeth show the shoulders getting wider, accentuated by the taller sleeve rolls. By the late 1570s, the rolls are almost off the shoulder. The separate contrasting sleeves have gotten much fuller than we saw in the 1560s, as have the skirts. But wide shoulders and wide skirts help to create the illusion of a smaller waist without the need for actually cinching and pinching the body. Here we see the 1570s version of the semi-fitted one-piece gown worn open over a kirtle. One of the key characteristics of the gown in the 1570s is the turned-back collar, which serves to again emphasize the width of the shoulders. It's during this decade that the doublet-style bodice becomes fashionable for women. While gowns with high-necked bodices had existed before, the bodices of these gowns have distinctly masculine doublet-inspired features, such as button closures down the front and tabs at the waist called skirts in the period. This style will continue to be fashionable throughout the rest of the century. The trend towards widening ruffs, sleeves, and skirts that started in the 70s only gets more extreme in the 1580s. The shoulders are very exaggerated and the sleeves are incredibly full. So full, in fact, that it becomes necessary to create an understructure to help hold out the shape of the sleeve. In written records from the period, these structures are referred to as farthingale sleeves, taking their name from the farthingale hoop skirts, which hold out the skirt to a fashionable width. Farthingale sleeves are some of the earliest examples of the use of whalebone as a stiffening in clothing. In the 1580s, whalebone, or baleen, was still a very new material and not widely used except in elite fashion, but we'll get more into that momentarily. Ruffs now reach their widest and will remain this size into the early years of the 17th century. Because of their enormous width, starch alone is no longer adequate to support their shape, and supports made of wire, pasteboard, or the new whalebone become necessary to prop them up. It's also in the 1580s that it becomes more common to see bum rolls being worn to provide shape to the skirt of the gown. Although that exact term doesn't show up in Elizabeth's wardrobe accounts, it is seen in other written sources. Previously, the skirt of the gown itself would be supplemented with rolls of fabric in the pleats of the skirt to provide extra volume, which was part of the gown's construction. For example, in 1576, Elizabeth had a gown made with a roll of white baize in the pleats. In 1586, we see a reference to the newer separate roll in a bill to Elizabeth's farthingale maker for making a roll of starched buckram with whalebone. It's possible that the whalebone was inserted into channels that went around the circumference of the roll, which is an interpretation of the bum roll seen in this image. Hairstyles also got bigger to balance the increased size of sleeves, ruffs, and skirts. It was fashionable for the hair to be frizzed or crimped, curled, and teased, and formed into rolls on either side of the head, giving a heart-shaped appearance. Now we come to the 1590s. I think this is a decade of fashion that you either love or hate because it is truly one of the most unnatural silhouettes ever created. Super elongated torsos, drum-shaped skirts, and huge sleeves. It's wild. Material culture historian Sarah Bendall argues that the extreme silhouette we see in the 1590s is facilitated by the simultaneous rise of the whaling industry in England and the increasing use of whalebone as a material in clothing. I highly recommend you check out her work, which I will link to below. You can listen to a couple of her excellent lectures for more information about the use of whalebone in the early modern period and its influence on fashion. Whalebone makes it possible to create the necessary understructures for the fashionable silhouette. I've already talked about whalebone used in farthingale sleeves, and whalebone replaced bents, or bundles of dried grasses or reeds, in farthingale skirts. But perhaps most important to the evolution of women's fashion is the use of whalebone as boning in bodies, or pairs of bodies, as they were known. As I mentioned previously, the support garment for women for most of the 16th century was the kirtle, which had bodies stiffened with layers of fabric, such as buckram and canvas, but no boning. In the late 1580s and 1590s, we begin to see references to bodies stiffened with whalebone that has been inserted into channels stitched into the garment. And what's more, the bodies are now being made without a permanently attached skirt. The skirt, or petticoat, is made separately and then pointed or tied to the bodies using eyelet holes stitched into the waist of the bodies. The stiffness yet flexibility of whalebone allows for the creation of a much more dramatic shape in the torso, particularly the elongated front. We can see this in the 1590s portrait of Elizabeth Vernon in her pair of bodies, petticoat, and jacket or waistcoat. The pair of bodies for the effigy of Queen Elizabeth, while made in 1603, are of a similar style to those worn in the 1590s, and provide us with one of the only surviving examples of early boned pairs of bodies. The stiffness of whalebone likewise made possible the gravity-defying shape of the farthingale that evolved in the late 1580s from the bum rolls mentioned earlier. Often called a French farthingale today, these farthingales created a drum-like silhouette to the skirt, standing out almost perpendicular to the torso. No farthingales of this style survive, and images of them are incredibly rare, so their form and construction are all educated guesses for now. One image of a French masque may provide a clue as to what they look like. Some of the performers wore a short circular skirt with concentric bands that may be casings for whalebone. Because of the sharp angle created by this style of farthingale under the skirt, it became fashionable to create a tuck or fold in the skirt at the edge of the farthingale to make a more attractive line. Previously, fashion historians interpreted this as a separate flounce, but closer examination of portraits from this period reveal that it's a tuck or fold in the skirt which was pinned or basted in place. As the decade progressed, the heart-shaped hair of the 1580s evolved into a more uniform fullness around the face. By the opening years of the 17th century and Elizabeth's death in 1603, hair was starting to emphasize height at the top of the head. I hope you've enjoyed this journey with me through the fashions of the Elizabethan era. These two images of Queen Elizabeth from the beginning and end of her reign show just how much fashion changed in those 45 years. Do you have a favorite Elizabethan style or decade of fashion from the 16th century? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.